I'm going to talk a little bit about my work. I'm going to begin by telling you a story of a conversation that I had with some people a few days ago in Brazil. I was presenting at a conference for therapists, and one of the things that I have preferred to do over the last recent years is travel not with videotapes. People always want to see a demonstration conversation or a demonstration interview, and I've decided that with videotapes, number one, there are always technical difficulties, and number two, it's like you're creating what you want the other person to see and experience. So I'd much rather have volunteers from the participant group to come up and talk with me about something that we can all experience at the same time and look at sort of our different descriptions, our different realities, our different interpretations about what has happened. So the first day of the workshop, I mentioned in the morning that in the afternoon after lunch, I would like for some people to volunteer. So I asked for volunteers, and the first hand went up, and the woman said, I want to talk about working with sexual abuse from a collaborative perspective, and I also want to know how to work in a modernist setting from postmodern perspectives. I thought, okay. Sounded kind of like maybe more of an idea kind of conversation. I said, anybody else have something they want to talk about? And before I could get the words out of my mouth, another hand went up, and it was a man, and he said, I also want to talk about sexual abuse. And then another hand went up and said, I also want to talk about sexual abuse. I said, okay, why don't the three of you come up? Now, my inner conversation was, oh my gosh, this is not the best thing to start with. It's a very complex, lots of strong opinions and values around this particular kind of work. But I invited them up, and while I was busy gathering the chairs for us, there was a lot of confusion, and all of a sudden there were like 3 or 4 extra people. And I found out that there were 3 or 4 extra people who also wanted to talk with me about how to work with sexual abuse from a social construction postmodern perspective. So I said, I think given the time that we have, I can really only talk with 3 of you, if you don't mind. And if you could decide which 3 that would be wonderful. And I'll find some way to talk with each of the rest of you during the conference. So they decided the fair thing was for the first 3 to be the people to talk with me. Okay, so we sat down, and I said, I would like to ask you, if you don't mind, to please introduce yourself to the participants, your name, and a little bit about the context and where you work. So each person did that. And then I said, if you don't mind, I'd like for you just to think for a moment about your expectations of this conversation. If we're going to spend some time together, what are you hoping will come from our talking? So I gave them a couple of minutes to think, and then I turned to each of them and asked them if they would share with the rest of us what their expectations were. Well, the first woman said that she had a family that she was working with where there were 2 young girls who had been sexually abused, and she had been working with them for some time, and she could not get the girls to talk about the sexual abuse. And they knew that she knew about it, but they wouldn't talk about it. I said, okay. The next person, the man said, well, I have a case that didn't go well. I'm not working with them now, but I'd like to learn how not to make the same mistakes the next time I work with a similar situation. Okay, thank you. And then the third person was the first woman who had volunteered, and she said, I want to know how to work from sexual abuse from a collaborative perspective, etc. So I thought, okay, all I know is to begin to invite each person's story. Now, although this was a conference for therapists, and these are people talking about therapy issues, this could just as well have been a conference for managers, and I could have had 3 managers volunteer to talk about something that was occupying them. So for those of you who are more in organizations and businesses, you might try to make that translation as I'm talking. One of the reasons that I like to have 2 or 3 or 4 volunteers rather than just interviewing or having a conversation with one person, is because I want the participants to focus on the process and not so much the content of the story. It's very easy to get seduced into the content of the story and to be seduced into the expert consultant, the expert coach, or the expert therapist, and try to fix the problem that's being presented. So I had asked people, I said, please try to focus on the process of what we're doing together, including the participants. So the first woman begins to talk, and she tells a very lengthy story, very complex, lots of characters. She begins with a referral, and she talks on and on and on and on. So we finally get to what appeared to be the end of the story, and I, at least up to date with the last session she had with this family. And I said, is that all, or may we pause now? And she said, no, that's all. And I said, well, thank you, and a couple of other comments. And I said, if you don't mind, I'm going to listen to the other two's stories, and I'll come back to you. So during the time that I talked with her, I really made very few comments. It might be like, oh, really, or wow, or and then what happened? Those kinds of comments. I really didn't ask her any questions. Then the next man tells his story about his failed therapy. And it's the same thing. Very complex, long-standing piece of clinical work, lots of members of the system, and the bottom line was that he had been fired by the family and by the woman that he was working with, who happened to be an adult woman. So I asked him at a place where it seemed like he was pausing, was that all, or was there something else that he thought that we should know? And he said, no, that's all. Just as the third woman's getting ready to speak, he says, oh no, I have something very important to tell you. And I said, oh, okay, if you don't mind, let me hear what he has to say. So he continued telling a little bit more about the firing. And then the third woman said, well, I've decided I want to talk about a case that I'm working with that's not going well. So she told another very long, complex, complicated story, and with lots of characters. And throughout all of these stories, not only were they complex, lots of characters, but of course, as you can imagine, dueling realities. Lot of discrepancies. And that each of the therapists had been trying very hard to get members of their therapy system to do what they thought was best for them to do. All while I'm hearing each of these stories, I'm sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, Harlene, what in the world are you going to do with this? And it just kept getting more and more and more. And I was really trying to be congruent and fit in with their preferred way of talking about what was important to them. So with each of them, I said very, very little. I don't think I asked maybe one or two questions totally. And then I thought, okay, so I've heard each of these very long, complicated stories. I'm also aware of the time. I'm aware of the participants in my peripheral vision who are beginning to get a little bit restless and moving around from these long stories. And also I was imagining that they were having ideas about what I should be doing. I should be asking more questions, I should be intervening, or whatever it is they thought that I should be doing. But I was certain that they had their expectations of what we were going to do would look like, and that it wasn't going to look like what it looked like. So I said to the three of them, I said, well, if I may ask you, I said, this may be a little premature, but I'm just wondering if, as you've been talking, if you've had any kind of beginning ideas about the expectations that you had for our conversation. In other words, you have any of your own beginning answers to your questions. And no, they didn't. But they each said in one way or another that it was like something was kind of bubbling or stewing. They didn't have words for it. They couldn't put their fingers on it, but you had the sense there was something beginning to move. And then I said, well, I'm wondering, I said, I was having some thoughts as you were each telling your story. Would you be interested in hearing what I was thinking? And they might have been polite, or they might have been really interested in hearing, I don't know, but they said, yes, we're interested. So I shared two thoughts that came to mind at that moment. And one had to do with thinking that, I said for myself, that when I am working with something, whether it's in the therapy room or in a business, an organization, that's very complex, it's very long-standing, where there are lots of clashes and lots of high expectations, that I really try to have modest expectations of myself and what I might be able to do with this situation, and that likewise I also have modest expectations for the people who are presenting, the people that I'm working with. And that I find that that gives me some freedom, some flexibility, some maneuverability, not to have that kind of pressure on myself or put that kind of pressure wittingly or unwittingly on another person. And then I said, the second thing that I was thinking about is that it seems like one of the commonalities in each of your situations is that you were uninvited guest. Well, they began to have big smiles and they kind of chuckled, because that morning I had been talking about guest and host, using that metaphor that the therapist, the consultant, the coach is always a guest in another person's life, and about the kind of guests that we prefer to have in our homes and our offices, the kind of guest you want to be, and likewise, that you're always hosting another person in your space. And what kind of host do you want to be? What kind of host have you experienced that you thought really welcomed you, liked you, and would like to have you back in their space again? So there was some chuckling. We talked about that a little bit. And then I said, I'm wondering now, again, this may be premature, but I'm wondering if you would mind sharing your reflections or what was going on in your bubble as each of you were listening to the other two tell their stories about their dilemma. And it was almost like their whole tone, body posture, everything began to change as each of them began to talk. And they had several things that they were saying, and I'm going to read some of their words so that I'm not misconstruing this. And then I'm going to come back and tie this into some points about collaborating and having generative conversations. So what had happened is that each of them were listening to the other person's story, their own distress began to fade into the background as they became so drawn into and so immersed into listening to and interacting and having their own inner conversation about the other's story. One of them said, it was like listening to a familiar story, but hearing it differently. Another said, I realized how we want to give solutions and answers when we don't need to and when our clients really don't want them. Another said, how engaged I became in the other's story and mine lost some of its urgency. Can I listen and not interrupt my clients like Harlene listened? How can I not doubt my client's truth? How can I not be an investigator, thinking that there's something behind their words that they're not telling me? And then they all talked more about the importance of listening carefully and attentively and in a way that the other person knows that that is what you're doing and that you value them and that you think what they have to say is worthy of hearing and listening to. So at this time I said, well, the clock says we must pause now, but I'll first ask, do you have any questions of me at this point? And they said no, and each person indicated that they were satisfied in some way. And I thanked each of them profusely for being so generous to share their work, and particularly work that didn't go well and that they were very distressed over, to sit in front of 200 people and talk about something that was a failure. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this. There's a lot more to the story and what happened with the larger group and with them the next day, but we don't have time for that just now. I'll talk about that perhaps in my workshop tomorrow. What I'm curious, though, is that I know that Sheila and Karsten have bubbles that are overflowing with thoughts and words. So I want to turn to you now before I continue and tie this story to some assumptions and ideas and hear what the two of you have been thinking about. What thoughts have been rolling around in your head?
Should I go first?
Sure.
No. Well, I think listening to you, that's not the first time I do that, and been reading some of your stuff. I think that one of the main learnings for me from coming from constructionism is that the language we use is faithful. And I think listening to your story about working with people, it's no coincidence that you sort of taken up in a direction that you call collaborative inquiry, because I think this is a very excellent example of, well, maybe that's the most important thing that we can do. And actually that what I heard that you did with these people, that collaborated you with them, you were surprised with this subject, you were surprised with the number of them, but you still sit there and just listen to them and sort of let them collaborate with you. So I think that collaborative inquiry, having that as a guideline for whatever we do, I think anyway that's a vital learning. And I also think about in the situation you described, I can picture myself supervising or coaching a group of managers who one after the other having bigger and bigger trouble or a catastrophe they wanted me to help them with, feeling that being pressured back in the seat of, oh my God, what am I going to do? But listening to you, I think I'm realizing that maybe the most important skill that we have, that make it also sometimes could help us relieve of that pressure, is it's actually our attention. The intense listening. You said you hardly asked any question. You just facilitated what I think one could put at that they could listen to their own stories and learn from their own stories and, of course, from the other stories, right? So I guess those two things are sort of my main bubbles right now. And I think it's really valuable for even very skilled practitioners like yourself that we are in these situations and that's a helpful skill. Just give people your undivided attention and they'll find a way.
One of the first things that you said, what it makes me think about is that there's really no one definition of collaborating. No. That collaborating is doing what the occasion calls for. Yeah. Being flexible, being adaptable, being able to be spontaneous in the situation and respond to what is given to you. I think of what's given to me as a gift and how do I accept that gift.
Yeah, Harlene, what I was thinking about was how the questions asked, you know, the problems or the issues that they were asking you, the expert, to help them with, were almost like, well, we've been, in all the workshops I've been in here, it's been the same issue. You know, how do I do it the right way while knowing that there isn't? And so by telling those stories, what actually I was thinking about mostly is your inner dialogue. And it reminded me of a consultation I did where I didn't quite know what I was going to do, but I kept having this inner conversation. How would I feel if I were them? And what would I need to feel comfortable having this conversation? And I heard echoes of that in your own, instead of, okay, I'm going to tell them how to solve this problem, how to deal with sexual abuse from a collaborative, constructionist perspective. You know, that you were having that inner dialogue which only opened up new questions. And the difference really in this collaborative approach for me is not in having the answer or telling someone how to be collaborative or constructionist, but rather is to be it. To be in that moment. As you say, you don't know how you will do it until you're in that situation. And having been in Brazil, I think I had the same people who told very long stories in a session like that. But that's another issue that really struck me, is how being heard, having the opportunity to tell the story, changes the way we understand. We get to become listeners of our own stories, and hearing it particularly in that sort of context juxtaposed to the other stories in front of a large audience, I'm assuming. You're invited to hear your own story differently and hear the question, the initial question, how can I be better? How can I solve the problem? As maybe not the right question, but the question is, how could I position myself differently in this moment?
Yeah, there's so many things I'm thinking about as you're talking, Sheila, is starting at the end, is that we have ideas that we start with a goal or a question to answer. And what I find is that in the process of the work, that shifts and that changes. And if you try to stick with that beginning goal or agenda, you can get into trouble.
Yeah.
And then the importance of, I think, having space for listening and speaking, which we often don't do. And we often don't give our clients to tell their story in the way that they want to, because we interrupt them with questions for things that we think are important for them to tell or for us to hear about.
Yeah.
So, so many things.
Also, in my own experience, I have found that there are different ways of doing this, but the most important thing to do is to prepare people to have a different kind of conversation. Mm-hmm. So in my own consulting work, I find that the 90% of the work happens before we ever come together for the consultation. What I often do is have one-on-one conversations with people ahead of time. And while there may be a lot of hostility or anger or problems in the organization, having those conversations, people then are positioned to come together in a different way, because they know their story's been heard, it's been respected by me, and we've built a relationship, which is probably the most important part. You know, first we have a relationship, so I'm not the consultant coming in that only a couple of people know. And I think, you know, that preparing people to be in a different kind of conversation is an absolutely important ingredient in the whole process. And there are many ways to do that, but often we don't pay enough attention to that. Piece. Yeah.
And I think also our being prepared.
Yeah.
So, and that's a good segue into what I'm going to talk about next, which is the philosophical stance. And John Schottert has been writing recently about being prepared versus planning. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I'm going to talk about what I call a philosophical stance, but I'm going to tell you a little bit first about where it came from. I was reminded yesterday by one of my colleagues that over 20 years ago, Harry Galushan and I wrote an article called Human Systems as Language Systems, in which we articulated some of our ideas and assumptions that had been developing about our practices. And although they were theoretically informed, what's most important, I think, for us was that they were also practically, they were informed by the practice, by our clients' voices, and in two ways. One, because we worked in a medical setting at a medical school where you were kind of the last hope. People sent cases for consultations, treatment failures, et cetera, et cetera, and et cetera. And we often wondered, why would we think that we have any more expertise than our colleagues out in the field on the front line? So we began to ask our clients, and then I began over about 20 years interviewing our clients as well as clients of therapists around the world about their experiences of successful and unsuccessful therapy, and some of the things that I learned from them, the advice that they had for us as to how to do our jobs better, have been really critical in informing the work, and I'm not going to go into the detail of those right now. The other thing that began to happen is our interest in language and in learning the client's language, and in the practice of really immersing yourself in trying to learn, use, and understand the other person made some huge shifts in the way that we were with our clients. All of these practice things were going simultaneously along with being interested in what I call more contemporary hermeneutics, social construction, postmodern, narrative, dialogical theories, and begin to think in terms of really that we had not developed a different or a new or an alternative kind of theory, but we were really developing for ourselves a philosophy of life, a way of thinking about ourselves, a way of thinking about being in relationship with other people, whether that was in our professional arena or whether that was in our personal arena. And so over time, we began to think about it as a philosophical stance. And so that's what I connect with being prepared. It's a set of ideas, a set of assumptions that are really beliefs or values or things that you are prejudiced, that I'm prejudiced toward, biased toward, that I find helpful and allow me to be the kind of human being with other people that I prefer to be and hope that I am at least most of the time. So the philosophical stance really became I don't like the word conditions, but the conditions for collaborative relationships and dialogical conversations, which is the sort of the heart and spirit of my work and my colleagues' work. collaborative relationships and dialogical conversations, and connected to Wittgenstein's idea that relationships and conversations go hand in hand, that they inform each other, that the way you begin to talk with people begins to influence the kinds of relationships that you'll be able to have with them, and vice versa. The kinds of relationships the way you begin to meet and greet people begins to influence the way that you'll be able to talk with them, the quality of the kinds of conversations that you can have. So what I'll do is I'll go through 7 of these characteristics of the philosophical stance. I have a PowerPoint that also has this, and it's on the McMahon-Berg website, and I'll also put it up on my own website when I get back to Houston. So, okay, the first thing on the list is conversational partners. And that refers to really thinking about what you're doing, what you're engaging with the other person, is that you're really engaging in a partnership that will be more rather than less equitable. And that the primary process or activity of this conversational partnership is what I think of as a mutual exploration or shared inquiry into what it is that's most important to the client at that time. Again, whether this is a therapy client or a consultation client, a coaching client, or an OD client. And that there's so many pieces of how you invite someone into a shared or mutual inquiry, into doing something with you, being in there together. It has to do really with talking with, being with, responding with another person, rather than thinking about them, doing to, for them. Again, it's this in there together. I like to think of it as we're just kind of wrinkling our brows together. We're puzzling over something together. Let me just see if there's something else on that one that I really want to say, but I have not thought about just then. It requires being a learner, to always think of yourself as the learner, and the client that you're working with is the teacher. And one of the things that I have found is that as I'm a learner, as I am genuinely curious and interested in another person, that this learning, this curiosity becomes contagious. So what begins as a one-way inquiry then shifts rather spontaneously more into a two-way inquiry as people begin to engage with you or with themselves into looking at, talking about, describing something, thinking about it in a slightly different way. And as Ken was pointing out yesterday, that you're always in the process of being on the way to understanding. There's never a point where you reach a full understanding. You can never really understand another person. But you reach a point where you agree that, yes, we think we understand this in a similar way. And that it's a moving process. Understanding is always a target. And again, referring to John's work, which he'll probably also talk about, is he talks about transitory understanding. There's always transitions in understanding. It never stays still. So I liked the way that you named that. And again, as I talked about with the people from Brazil, giving people the space in the room to tell their story in the way and the manner in which they want to tell it, not the way that we think they should be telling it, and not the details or information that we think is important, but stay with what they think is important because they're giving you a gift that both of you can work with. So one of the things in Brazil that I did is I had all the participants talking with each other and putting their words to what they thought was happening in this conversational, collaborative, quote-unquote, demonstration, and to tie it to some of the things that I had been talking about this morning. So in terms of conversational partnership, they talked about my being interested and curious, and particularly what struck them was my following the client, so to speak, storytelling manner, that I was not trying to impose something externally on them or create or use a pre-planned structure for the storytelling, but that it evolved as we went along together. Okay, bullet number 1, conversational partners. Bullet number 2, relational expertise. The idea that we create expertise, you can use the word knowledge, truths, values, beliefs, with each other. It's not a singular process. Again, Ken talked about this some yesterday, so I won't elaborate a lot on it. This idea really came in learning from clients about their experiences of unsuccessful therapy and how therapists kept trying to give them their expertise when they thought either it didn't fit or I've already tried that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and missing the wealth of local knowledge, local expertise that has lots of resources, lots of usefulness, and not accessing that. That we've all been trained to have professional expertise. However, what I think is most important is what I said earlier, is the ability to be flexible, to be spontaneous, and to be adaptable, and to be able to follow the other person's lead and learn from them. So the comments from the Brazil participants was that I did not need to give them answers. I did not need to answer their expectations because they did it themselves. Third bullet is not knowing, which has been one of the most controversial things that Harry Galishan and I ever wrote about, because it's often misunderstood to mean either you don't know anything, or you pretend to not know something, or you throw everything away that you know before you walk into the therapy room or the boardroom or the classroom, and that is not the case. Not knowing really has to do with the way that one thinks about what it is that they might know, the intent with which they use it, and the manner, the tone, and the attitude and the timing with which it's introduced. And that it's thought of, knowledge is thought of as being introduced as a way of participating in the conversation, food for thought and dialogue. Perhaps this is a way we can talk about it. This is something that I've read from research. Would you be interested in hearing about this? So again, being tentative in your offering of your own professional knowledge and paying very, very careful attention to the way the other person responds to you, so that your response is more coherent and more fitting, and that you're not trying to sell them something, a product, so to speak, that they're not interested in purchasing. One of the things about not knowing that I think is also helpful is that it safeguards treating people as types or kinds or categories or diagnoses, and meeting them as another human being, and helping to remind oneself that you are not a technocrat or some kind of mechanical person, but you as a professional are also another human being, and that you're in a very serious, intimate relationship with the other person. Bullet number 4 is being public. And this refers to being open, sharing those bubbles, letting people have a peek at what's in your bubble. This also came from interviewing clients over the years who said they always wondered what their therapist really thought about them. Where did the question come from? My therapist was asking me, it seemed like the same question in 4 or 5 different ways, but I never really could answer it correctly because I really didn't know what they wanted to know. If they had just told me what they really wanted to know, I could have responded. So they want access to our private thoughts. And so I began to think, why not? Number 1, this is the most respectful way to be with another person, to be open and honest and be forthcoming as to why you're interested in a particular line of inquiry or have a particular question or thought. And then secondly, and I think most importantly, is that when you share your inner thoughts with the other person, first of all, the process of articulating those inner thoughts begins to create something different than what was rolling around in your head. It also invites the other person to respond to that. They can like it, they can not like it, they can throw it in the trash can, and again, paying very careful attention to how they respond to it. It also helps you prevent slipping into a monologue in your own head. And so by monologue, I'm referring to just having the same story, the same tune over and over again. And as the person you're talking to continues to talk, you're hearing the story through the same ears, you're seeing their gestures, their eyes through the same lens, and it's more of the same, and which can lead to stuckness and also can blind you to the real novelty or the real usefulness of what they're giving you. Again, I think of it as a gift. So some of the Brazilian comments were that I didn't offer any promises. I didn't act like I wouldn't have anything to give them, but I said will, and they pointed out that I continued to use collective language. We'll try to address your expectations. I think that we can talk and find something that will be of use or value for you. Bullet number 5 has to do with the idea of mutually transforming. That when you're involved in the kind of relational and dialogical process that I'm talking about, you cannot help but be influenced by the other person and by the process and relationship in which you are engaged. That transformation, in other words, is a natural consequence of collaborative relationships and dialogical conversations. And the Brazilian comments had to do with my responding to the participants, which is another whole story of that when we finished and I had realized after the break how unsettled the participants were, how distressed they were at sitting and listening so long, and how disconnected they felt from this more intimate conversation up here. I apologized to them and said that I had made a big mistake because although I'm always aware of them, I did not prepare. I did not prepare them for the conversation, and I did not include them. I did not offer them ways in which they could be included in the conversation other than as a silent listener. And so the next day, we had another consultation with a woman and her sister who came in, real actual live clients, where I spent a lot of time preparing the participants to participate and belong to the conversation, including totally rearranging the room. And there were a lot of comments on that, and there was a lot of appreciation. So one of the things that I'll highlight here, people don't mind that you make mistakes. What they do like is if you say you're human, I made a mistake, and let's see how we can correct this. Okay, number 6 is uncertainty. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of ambiguity when you're walking alongside someone, when you decide to go on a journey with someone, and you have kind of a beginning idea of where you're going to go, but you don't know exactly if that's where you're going to end up or how you're going to get there. It's this mutually influencing endeavor that you're engaged in. And that I think that we're always living in uncertainty. And one of the things that the students, my primary home base is the Houston Galveston Institute in Houston, Texas. They talk about, after they've been at the Institute about 3 or 4 months, how that being able to learn to live with uncertainty gives them a sense of certainty. And as you ask them more about that word certainty, what they're talking about is they have more a sense of confidence. They have more of a sense of maturity, more of a sense of being prepared for whatever it is that walks into their office, whether it's a client with what they may seem like a big problem, whether it's a supervisor who's unhappy with something that they've just done, whatever it is, they feel they're prepared, that they can do what the occasion calls for. And again, the participants in Brazil talked about sitting there. What is Harlene doing by not doing anything, or what appears to be not doing anything? Where is she going? Where is this going to go? How is anything going to come out of this? And how surprised they were the next morning when what I did is I asked 2 people in the participant group who were teachers and trainers at universities and postgraduate institutes to have a conversation with the 3 about their experience of being together with me and what that was like for them. And it was absolutely amazing in terms of the generativity, not only in terms of during that conversation, but most importantly after it, that one of the things that I've come to learn is that the change or the transformation doesn't necessarily happen in the therapy hour, in the consulting hour, in the coaching session, but that those conversations, those relationships are springboards or invitations for conversations and relationships that will continue after your clients have left the room, and that you as well will continue and have conversations, and that you'll meet again and neither of you will be in the same place where you were when you left. So for me, it's the most important thing is not that there's something that magic happens in that moment together or in those minutes or that hour or those hours together, but can we begin something that begins to take on a life of its own after we're no longer together? Then bullet number 7, everyday ordinary life. And this really came as I began traveling around the world and meeting people with different languages and different cultures, meeting foreigners, although I think that each person I meet is a foreigner and that I need to learn from them about them. But what I began to think is that, there's really no such thing as big problems or little problems. There's not a problem that needs an atomic bomb. There's not one that just needs a little tap on the back. But what people are dealing with around the world are the circumstances, the situations, the dilemmas, the pains, the miseries, the tough decisions that we face in our everyday personal lives and in our everyday work lives. And that's what's important, talking with someone about what's important to them and trying to create a more collaborative and generative space for that particular kind of activity. I also begin to be prejudiced toward the idea that therapy or consultation or coaching conversations are no different than the conversations we have in our everyday ordinary life, no different from successful conversations. A colleague of mine in Germany once said, if all conversations were successful, there would be no reason to have consultants or coaches or therapists. So, of course, the context, the agenda, there are those kinds of differences, but in terms of the process of a successful conversation, I think that they're very much the same. And what I think of as the process of successful conversation and successful collaboration is that people have a sense of participation. A sense of participation invites a sense of belonging. A sense of belonging invites a sense of contributing. People really do like to contribute. They really do like to talk about themselves. They do like to tell their stories. A sense of contributing invites a sense of ownership. A sense of ownership, I think, invites a sense of shared responsibility. And I think all of these combined lead to more sustainable outcomes or products, solutions or resolutions, whichever of those words that you prefer. So I'm going to pause here and turn back to the two of you and hear more about your bubbles, if you don't mind.
Harlene, everything you say resonates with me, and what I'm thinking about, my bubble right now, has to do with, I think, a question that we all here are concerned with. What does it mean to be a professional if we're working within a constructionist collaborative frame? And there's a tension, there's an irony in that. You are a professional, you have to have your training to be a professional, you're supposed to have the answers. And much of what you've said, to take a not knowing approach, to be curious, to be human, it's no different than ordinary conversation, is, counter to what we've all had to go through to get to where we are. So my ongoing question for myself as a professor, as an academic and a practitioner, is how do I transform training, education, so that it embodies these principles, where people feel that they can, in fact, inhabit them, utilize them, feel like a professional, but with a completely transformed notion of what that means.
Of what that means to be a professional.
To be a professional.
And not that you don't use what you've learned, and not that it's not valuable,
Right.
but it's the way in which
Right.
you use it. Absolutely,
Exactly.
I think that's the critical point. And I'm so biased toward the doing of it, creating experiences, creating opportunities for people to experience, to play with the ideas, and to develop their own understanding of the ideas.
Right. And what I find is instead of, sitting, I'll tell a short story
Sure.
about my own training as a therapist. I had worked in my doctoral work with a colleague who was getting his doctorate in family therapy. I was in communication. But we worked together because we were both studying therapeutic process. And we were using the same ideas. And when we finished our degree, he phoned me and he said, I'm going to pay you to go to a training program in therapy because I know you don't want to just study the process. I know you really want to be in the room doing the therapy. And I did. He understood, but I was petrified to do this. I could, study the process. That was very safe for me. First night I arrive to the therapy training, and he announces to the group, we have a family, and it's a perfect family for Sheila because it's a communication problem. And then we proceeded to unfold what the problem was with the family. There was a 22-year-old, I was 27 at the time, 22-year-old young man diagnosed as schizophrenic. His sister, who is 23, diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and who unfortunately had suffered multiple sexual relations with her father. The two parents, the uncle who had murdered someone, and this was a communication problem. So
Whatever communication meant to them, yeah.
I immediately wanted to change my area of expertise, but we processed the family. I did the whole pre-session as we did in those days, and then I went in, scared to death, and I had my little list, of prepared topics and questions, and I sat with the family, asked the first question. And they answer, I was not listening at all. I go to the second question. In 5 minutes, I'm finished with everything on my cheat sheet, gone. And I'm thinking, save me, please save me. And all of a sudden, there's a knock on the door. I jump out of my seat, run out the door. And there's Sergio, and he says, Sheila, what did you do your doctoral dissertation research on? And I look at him, I say, Sergio, what are you asking me this question for now? I'm dying in there, help me. He said, no, come on. I said, Sergio, we work together, no, come on, tell me, what did you do? And I said, I did research on therapeutic process. Well, how did you do that? I interviewed families and I interviewed therapists about their experiences. Did you find that easy? I said, yes. He said, go back in that room and act like a researcher. And it was a transformative moment because I find when we talk about expertise and how to be with families, with clients, with people we work with, even, as an educator, we think about the professional identity as of course, the expert position. We are supposed to know, we're supposed to help. And in fact, if we can take what's familiar for us, the resources that we have garnered through the years, through our relations with others, and transform them into a new context and utilize what's familiar in an unfamiliar context. I could be a researcher instead of a therapist.
Right.
Then I could be in the moment with the people that I was with.
Yeah,
and
more spontaneous and natural.
But I find that's a challenge for encouraging people to use what they bring to the conversation, what they bring to the relationship, because it always is the appearance that there's some expert stuff I really should be bringing.
And I think, unfortunately, all of our educational systems, or most of them, I won't say all of them, are designed that way. Yeah. Very traditional in that they're a certain body of knowledge that you develop competency on. You use that in that there's certain skills and techniques that you use. As a therapist, there are certain questions that you will ask. And one of the things that I do with the students who come to the Institute to do their post-master's and doctorate clinical practice, I'm very provocative. The first day they come, they get a client, because I think practice and theory go hand in hand. And I say, what I want you to do is I want you to go into this room with this client, and please, I do not want you, I forbid you to do therapy. All I want you to do is to go sit down and talk with them and get to know a little bit about them. Because I think what you're talking about is that we lose how to just be in relationship and talk to people.
Right.
Yeah, when we think there's a way to do it.
Yeah.
Dying to know what's in your bubble.
Yeah, it's a lot. You can sit here.
A lot of
A couple
bubbles.
of
Yeah.
examples actually came up in my head when you talked initially about being prepared, but being prepared in a not knowing way. And I have sort of, when I teach this, or also trying to use this on myself, is that from this example I'll give you in a minute, I learned that you cannot listen to others when your mouth is full of your own words. And I think that's a good way to put it, because I think we very often do that. Because often being prepared is being prepared with all what's in my head that could come out, and actually not being prepared for listening intensely to the others. And one of the cases that really taught me that is that my colleague and Jesper and I were working with a center within elderly care, where they had a sick rate from 20% over the last year. And we decided from our approach not to go in there and look for the reasons for sick leave, but actually looking for what was it that made the 80% go to work. So what we were looking for, what created presence. And we were, doing this in the teams, and it worked very well. And then one day I ended up in a team, and I was prepared because I know what's going to happen. And usually the other teams, they were sort of skeptically, the first couple of teams, but then the rumor got around that this were a nice process and probably nice guys. So and suddenly I find myself 8 women like this. And I said, okay, can you tell me more about it? This is a waste of time. Okay, so why do you think it's a waste of time? We have no problems. We are a very good team. Okay. And I guess from then I went back. I didn't listen very much, but I cut the routine and took one at a time. So tell me a little bit more about what makes you such a good team. And I think I went on until the 4th or the 5th person, not listening to anyone, just, what the heck am I doing? What the heck should I do? I have them a whole day. It's only 20 minutes now. And then suddenly, I think I noticed one of them said, well, it's because we have so much respect. And I guess everyone up to that said that, but I noticed that respect. And I said, okay, yeah, that's nice. And then I noticed the next person said respect in the same way, and I noticed the rest of them said respect that way. And I guess I was sort of puzzled with that, and I was thinking, well, it seemed like they are very respectful, but the way they just pronounce that word is not with a lot of respect. I'm sort of pushed back on the wall with it. So I was again struggling with, starting the second round, how do I get into this? So I had a fortune to see Carl Tom work from Calgary, Dan and Sally's colleague, and see some of his work. And when he also, some word who, sort of this general word, like respect, the question he used was, how do you do it? So I suddenly, thank you, Carl. So I asked him, how do you do respect? And we got around, and that was much more attention. Gave a lot of good examples about how to do respect. So it seems like it's a very good team. But 2 of them most leaned back at the back, who at the beginning said, we cannot learn more of each other. We've been working together for 22 years. We've been living next door. We've been on maternity leaves, in maternity groups. We know each other. And our husband plays cards together. We can't learn no more. So I went to the first of these ladies and said, can you give me an example of how you do respect? Yes. When we enter into the home, sometimes of the elderly, then sometimes we work together. And if I see my colleague do something that I know is not entirely proper here, that the elderly want things maybe put in a different order, what I do is that I show respect to this person whose home we're in and correct things immediately. And I could see the person in the next chair, who she knew everything about, was moving a bit. It's an interesting case. And I asked her, could you give me an example of respect? Yes, he said. in the cases when we're working together in an old person's home and I see something that's vital, if it's vital enough for us to learn about, I write it down. And when we are in the car on our way home or we go back to the office, I tell my colleague this story because in my world, I cannot learn when the client is there. I think I almost feel offended about it. And the woman next to her said, "My God, now I know why she's so cross with me. Sometime when we've been working together, she won't talk over the hedge for a whole week." Remember those magic moments where in a conversation with people or a question is asked that takes forever. And I guess an example of that is that we did a huge project with staff in a drug abuse center. And one of my colleagues, Thomas, was out there. We were sort of interested in what comes out of it. I mean, training all the staff, that's fine, and they were enthusiastic. But there's that show in the life of the drug abusers. And Thomas were interviewing some of these persons. And I remember one of these answers was that, well, it's strange. They used to treat us like drug abusers. Now they treat us as human beings. And they ask these strange questions. It can take up to a week to answer. And I mean, this person obviously didn't know anything about what we're doing, but I think this is, so it didn't really matter if we spent 3 years working with people. I mean, this one story is that excellent. I was having this respect about, don't go for the immediate solution. Pay the attention, ask the good question. Then people have the expertise to work things out.
One of the things I think about is the idea that questions aren't posed to be answered, but they're posed as starting points or invitations for conversation. And I like you're making the distinction about being prepared to respond to what the other person offers you versus being prepared on the edge of your seat, ready to put in your expertise of what, just kind of waiting your time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. It's an important distinction, I think.
It is.